Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is working with comas. And my guest, Dr. Arnold Mindell, is the author of Coma, Key to Awakening. Dr. Mindell is the leader of the Center for Process-Oriented Psychology in Portland, Oregon and in Zurich, Switzerland. He's also the author of 7 other books, including Dream Body, The Process Psychology of the Dream Body, River's Way, and City Shadows. Welcome, Arnie.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
It is a pleasure.
Yeah. You know, the work you do with comas is so exciting to me because it challenges one of our most fundamental notions about people in comas, that they're unreachable, that they're in a vegetative, like dead state, and you find so much life in them.
Well, I wouldn't say I find life in them. People are lively in them. The assumption that people are, because they're in altered states of consciousness or in sleepy states or comatose states, the idea that there's nobody home is a prejudice. That's due to the fact that if you're not talking to somebody, you're not in order. So nobody has spent enough time trying to go into comatose states to understand and try to communicate with people there.
How did this work begin for you?
How did it begin? Well, when I began my practice in Zurich, Switzerland, 1968, I was always fascinated by people who were dying and people who were very sick, as well as normal people. And so I just began to visit them in the hospital and work with them, and working with anybody in a coma or anybody who's really sick over long periods of time frequently ends up working with them when they're also in comatose states or in sleepy states of unconsciousness.
In your work, the theories that you developed, process-oriented psychology, involves accepting what is as part of the human process and working with it, helping to amplify it, accelerate it, so that whatever a person presents to you, you seem ready to work with.
Well, that's right. Process-oriented psychology is meant to work with people in all states of consciousness and under any circumstances. That's its hope, or that's its attempt, that's its goal. Whether people are psychotic or in normal states, in comatose states, or groups of people, or people in relationships, the hope is that we'll develop a psychology that's unified enough to work with people regardless of what condition that they're in.
And my sense is that if I were to summarize this work, it has to do with the now moment, looking at what's happening and following its own course, amplifying it, and so that you can really get a handle on what really is going on.
That's right. The idea behind process work and behind this form of psychotherapy is that what is happening to an individual has all the keys to the solution of that person's problems. Right here in front of us, what is going on is the key to their difficulties.
So in that sense, I suppose a person in a comatose state is not necessarily any more unreachable or difficult to work with than a person in normal consciousness.
That's right. If you consider the whole person that you're working with, then you don't work with a person just who's able to talk. You work with a person who is also, his eyes are closed or her eyes are closed, and they're breathing deeply, and maybe coughing or even choking, and that all of those things are signals, they're attempts to communicate certain states of consciousness. That's the basic assumption.
So you must need to train yourself and the people who work with you in the art of observing these subtle little signals that most of us would tend to overlook.
That's right. I can give you an example of those signals. Think of a man that I mentioned in this book that you already talked about, Coma. While I was working with my mother in Miami some years ago as she was dying, there was this very difficult character in the next room who was groaning and making tremendous noises. Did you read that about this guy?
Yes,
Man,
yes.
I called Sam.
Yeah.
And he was dying of cancer. He must have been in his 80s. And he was, his eyes were closed, and he would groan loudly every now and then. And since
It was disturbing the hospital
disturbing the
staff.
hospital, and since he had been there for, it must have been 6 months on and off, and hadn't talked to anybody, the nurses and doctors knew that I was there. They said, well, why don't you come next door and see what you can do with Sam? He's a noisy character, and we don't know what to do with him.
Is this usual that somebody in a coma will be making noises?
No, well, people, it depends. They make noises. Sometimes there's pneumonia and they're drowning, but this was a person who would groan every now and then and make gurgling noises like that, and sometimes go, ooh, or his eyes wouldn't open like mine.
Important signals.
Important signals. So I went to see him in the next room.
But to most people,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt you.
Yes, do that,
Most people would think the hospital staff, these aren't signals, this is an annoyance, probably.
That's right. That's right. Well, the medical idea about the human being is that what's happening to you, if it's not normal, it's pathological. It's something wrong and something that should be healed. But the process idea is that what's happening to you is a signal trying to communicate you from your unconscious or from unconsciousness. It's your whole self trying to come out.
So in that sense, any phenomenon, any symptom isn't necessarily a pathology, it's part of a healing process.
That's right. We assume that what's happening to somebody, it's good to think of them as if they're sick and it needs to be healed, but it's not half as enriching and as inspiring as trying to find out the meaning of what it is. And to do that, you have to follow the very, very subtle signals of someone.
So as I recall, they called you in to look at this fellow Sam simply because they thought he was disturbing the whole ward with his noise.
Right, and because he was supposed to die already. He was like, had been around for a long time, and he would neither get better nor he was in a hospice situation. So should I tell you more about that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So there he is lying there, and his eyes are like half closed like this, and he makes noises every now and then, like that, and ooh, woo, and so that's a signal for me. And through my studies of signals and people's communication modes, I got closer to him, and I did the same thing he did. I amplified his signal. You just said that a minute before.
Yes.
And he went, ooh, and I went also with him, ooh, and he kept making the same gurgling noise. And I went with him. And then finally he went, ooh. And I went louder than him. And I said, ooh. And suddenly I knew that we had communicated because he no longer repeated the same signal but added something to it. He not only went, ooh, he went, ooh, woo. And I was shocked. Every time I work with somebody, even though I know they're real people down there, I was shocked that he was communicating. So I went with him and I said, woo, woo. And one of his eyes opened, and his eyes were like right up to the top of his head, like I'm doing right now with my eyes. His eyes were right up straight. I can't put them up as high as his were. And he went, woo, woo. And I said, go ahead and look, because when the eyes roll up like that, frequently people are visualizing something. And I said, what do you see up there? And he went, woo, woo, wah, wow. He went, wow, and I went, wow. And he said, wow, and I said, yeah, that's really amazing. I didn't know what he was seeing. And he said, oh, wow, wow. And I said, Sam, go and take a look at that. He said, wow, there's a shh, and it took a long time, and I won't take our time right now to go through the details of that, but suddenly, after about 5 minutes of doing that, he said, there's a ship. And I said, a ship? What kind of ship? And Sam said, there's a white ship, and it's coming for Sam. And I said, well, isn't that interesting? And he was looking up like that, and then we just continued that process and completed it. Yeah. And I said to Sam, yeah, there's a ship up there. Do you see that? And he said, yeah, woo, it's all white. And I said, well, it's a ship. Check out who's running the ship. Go down into the engine room and see who's down there. And Sam, whoa, wow, whoa. He made a whole bunch of noises and gurgling noises. He closed his eyes like that. Suddenly he opened them up and he said, hey, there's angels down there. And I said, well, if there's angels down the bottom of the ship, that's something new, isn't it? And he wasn't in a normal talking state, but he said, angels is down there. And I said, well, who's driving it? And he went up, his eyes up and visualized again. He saw angels driving the ship, Jeffrey. And then I said, well, what do you think, Sam? Sam said, uh-uh. And I said, what do you mean? Sam said, I ain't going on that ship. And I said, why not? And he went inside like that, and I followed his eyes going down like that. And even put my hand on the bottom of his eyelids like that. I said, go down and find out why you're not going. Suddenly he opened his eyes and he said, I ain't going on that ship. He says, I got to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I got to work. Sam has got to work. Sam has worked all his life. He's got to work. I'm a working man. So I said, good for you. I said, but just before we go back to work, Sam, you want to check on the ship and see what it would cost to go on that ship and where's it going? So he went inside again with his eyes like that down. And Sam murmured to himself, wow, he said, that ship, that don't cost nothing. It was interesting. And he was very fascinated by that. He said, that ship don't cost nothing. He said it again. And then I said to him, and where's it going? He said, oh, he said, that ship, that's going to Bermuda. So I said, the ship doesn't cost anything? It's going to Bermuda? That's something, he said. That's really something. And I said, well, what do you think? I've been working a long time, he said. I said, well, what do you think? You want to take that ship? He went down again like that. He said, I'm going to think about that. I said, okay. And he closed his eyes and he went into a sleep state. That means he looked like he was just relaxed and sort of half snoring like that. And I went out to see my mother, and when I came back a few minutes later, Sam had apparently taken that ship to Bermuda. He had died. Yeah. He had made the decision to go on vacation. So you could say that he was stuck right there at the end of his life in a coma for a while, in part because he was working on himself and he needed the time to make the decision, can I take a vacation or not? It was really like a psychological development that he needed to make.
His self-concept as a worker, as a person who was always working, kept him from dying until that point.
That's right. He was fighting his situation and fighting his dying. So he had cancer and he was just bones, and it was in a wicked state. But not everybody who you work with in a coma dies. I must say that. That's just one of these cases where he made the decision himself to die. No one decided to let him die. He decided.
Well, it seems to me that the really fascinating thing about your work, I think our viewers would find it most fascinating, is that somehow you manage to find a channel inside.
Yeah.
And it could be the most subtle thing, like just a little muscle tremor. It needn't be as obvious as Sam's noises.
That's right. That's right. Some people in comatose state, they do the following things with their face. I'll see if I can do this. If your cameras can pick that up, I don't know. But their eyes are closed or jittering, or some people are in a vigil coma like this. Their eyes are wide open and their pupils are undilated. I can't do that here. But the most common state is like this. They'll be down there and just their right eyelid, that's this one, moves just a teeny bit like the following. Now, I can't do just the right eyelid alone, you notice, because I'm not in that state. Maybe we can do the left one. I can't.
But it's the subtlest of motions.
And then I put my finger there and just wiggle it as well, like that. And then you make contact with that particular part of the person. That part is awake.
Yeah.
Other people, I know you're not, maybe you can't see my hands. Other people will be like this, Jeffrey. Their hands are in a corticoid posturing, that's called, like this, from strokes, what have you, and they're grasping and cramped. And there's various viewpoints on why the hand does that. But one of them is that the hand is doing this in part because you've got a stroke and part of your body is doing this, and another is that this is this is a signal. This is how we work. So one thing we do is just gently grasp that hand and pull on it, just very, very little, like that. And through that, you can get contact with a person. Sometimes people will pull back, like this. And one thing leads to another, and before you know it, usually within about 20 or 25 minutes, if the person is not heavily drugged or on morphium, the person will come back, regardless of what the cause is of their coma. But those who are in dying conditions usually come back quicker.
Mm-hmm.
And those who have been in accident cases and things like that, and traumatic injuries to the brain and suffocation or oxygen deficiencies, you can still make contact with them, but they don't come back so that you can hear them right away. They don't speak instantaneously.
So you need to, I suppose, in some of the most severe cases where there's a lot of brain damage, you've got to have some facility at nonverbal communication. They may
Yes.
never verbalize for you.
That's right. Like, for example, a man we worked on recently who had been hit over the back of the head. He was a taxi driver. Someone hit him over the back of the head. And they had to do an operation. They took out a good, huge section of his head. So here you see my bald head like this, and then his was like a huge piece of skull missing. And he was in a coma, and they didn't know whether he should live or die or what to do with him. But I did just exactly this. Amy and I, my wife Amy, we grabbed his arm, and after a couple of minutes he was yanking backwards. On response, we would say to him, "What's happening?" And he would pull back like that. And then suddenly he started to wrestle within his limitations of lying in bed and using his strength. And suddenly his wife, who had been depressed, yelled out loud. She said, "There you go, showing off again." Imagine, he hadn't spoken to anyone for 3 months. And as he started to come back, he wasn't speaking, but he apparently had been a weightlifter. And he was showing us how strong he was still, even though he hadn't had any communication with anybody for months. So watching somebody's signals and taking them seriously is very important.
Well, what do you do if you've got some kind of nonverbal signal? How can it become meaningful? Don't you want to know what's going on inside?
Yes. Well, with people who have been injured because of accidents, it takes time before they're able to talk again. One has to be very patient. But with people who are comatose or have gone into sleepy states just before they die, they are not, I have to say this, they are not in these states, Jeffrey, just because they're sick and dying. They seem to be using these comatose states in order to find out more about themselves. They're deeply trying to work on themselves like Sam. So to help them create the meaning, first you work with their intimate signals like that. You breathe at their rate. If they're going, then you go ahead and follow that breathing.
Follow the breathing.
By putting your hand on their shoulder and pushing and squeezing and relaxing in accordance with their breathing. That's hard to show just here without getting up and doing it.
Yeah. But sometimes you even climb into the bed with them.
Climb very close to them or put my head near their head. And because people in these states also love contact, you have to be careful and know the person and check out whether they're shy or whether for other reasons they don't want contact. But in some cases it's not necessary to do that, but others it is.
Well, you seem to be suggesting that these comatose states, rather than we view them as vegetative states, they might be something more akin to a yogic state of samadhi or a state of higher consciousness.
I don't assume it. I know that from working with people close to death. Everyone that we've worked with who is dying and isn't just simply brain injured, but everyone, Jeffrey, everyone, including the most unintelligent, the person who has never studied spiritual stuff and is not the least bit interested in, almost everyone comes back and they start seeing stars. They talk about the planets, or they talk about love or about going home. It's incredible. So I know people are not just vegetating down there. I know it. We've discovered that.
I mean, it suggests that we all could learn a great deal from interacting or being in the presence of these people.
That's right. Someone who is dying could be our greatest teacher. They're not the person that we knew ahead of time. They're the deepest aspect of that person. And when that starts to come out, it is incredible. It transforms grief and sadness even. If you can make contact with a person in this state before they die, it's almost it's not a celebration when somebody's dying, but it's a magnificent interaction. They speak from great distance and with great wisdom. The deepest parts of themselves come out.
Yeah. Well, this raises some major ethical questions about the comatose state and what it
Right.
means for our society. And many people who say, I don't want to live like a vegetable if I'm ever in that state, pull the plug
That's right.
and so on.
Well, maybe I can share some of our discoveries here. One of them is that the living will idea, that you say, if I ever go into a comatose state, I don't want to live anymore. That's important to take into consideration, but what a person writes in his normal or her normal state of consciousness and what they experience when they're in deep, altered states of consciousness, like comatose states, is very different. Few people know themselves at that depth. So, like for example, one of the people I describe in that book was a professor, and he said, if I ever go into a vegetative state, pull the plugs. But when we went down with him into that state, when he got sick, we visited him for just one time, and his family was terribly upset. Should we allow him to die or what? We worked with these facial signals and the eye movements and different parts of his chin and the shaking of his jaw, putting your finger like that just for a moment in somebody's jaw. And this was a man whose jaw was like frozen shut. And we developed a communication system so that he could answer us by moving that jaw. And when we asked him, do you now want to die? Would you like your family to encourage the medical community around you to just allow you to die? And he opened his mouth very widely, which was the signal to say that he was a no. He opened his mouth like that, which meant, don't let me die. And we asked him questions and got feedback from what he was doing down there, Jeffrey.
Now, let me interrupt
Yeah.
you because I get the sense that what you've managed to establish is a system where they can give you yes and no answers.
Exactly.
Non-verbally.
So we say to him, if you're going to say no, can you do something now to show us? He goes like that with his mouth. And if you're going to say yes, what is it? And he was going to wrinkle his eyes like that.
Yeah.
So
Like an
there-
ideomotor response in hypnosis.
That's right, exactly. Yes, people who've known Erickson and hypnotic methods who have seen us do this work say, well, that looks like hypnosis, absolutely. So once having established that, you have you have a mode of communicating with a person. And our ethics are that, and these are an ethics that need to be developed more, but at this point, our ethics say that you need to have at least two states of an answer from a person in two states of consciousness. In their normal state of consciousness, in other words, like you and I are talking right now, what do you do when you're dying and get caught in a coma? And the second state needs to be taken into consideration too, the dream or comatose state. And he said he wanted to go on living. So we have another piece of information. Then we asked him why and asked him various questions. There's a whole group of questions we ask people in comatose states. And one of them, he was a man in his 80s or early 90s. I can't remember what it was now. And he was interested in having an affair. He was interested in having an affair, and we wondered why his wife hadn't come she wasn't interested in visiting him. They had had some trouble or something like that. So he was interested in having an affair. He was having an affair. In fact,
in his inner world.
In his inner world, he was fantasizing or dreaming of being together with a woman, some beautiful woman of some sort, and they were hiking up a mountain together. And this now, the more classical psychologists would say, so he's individuating, he's growing, he's getting contact with his feminine side or something. But he was experiencing this as having an affair. So when his children saw that, they were smiling to one another and say, well, Papa would never, ever have done anything like that in his normal life. But and they were there looking at that, they said, well, gee, let's let him go on. And so this man went on another 3 or 4 months in that state, and then one day, we weren't there at this time, then just suddenly died. That was the end of it.
In other words, the processes that go on in the comatose state may be spiritually, psychologically valuable for the person.
Yes.
Necessary to complete before they die.
That's right. Yes.
And we have just a few minutes left, but
Yeah.
I do want to touch on the possibility of bringing people out of the coma from this state. Is that also part of your experience?
That's the work, to bring people out of comatose states, or at least to communicate with them in those states, so that you know what they're doing and that they appreciate people are not comatose because they want to be left alone. to die. People go comatose because that's the only state or the best state for them right now. They need to go internal and work on themselves to complete a part of their own personal life that hasn't been completed until now.
Now, one of the things that you wrote, which I think is a crucial point, is that sometimes people stay in comas because they get stuck in their internal process. And if you
Yes.
can help them move through that process,
That's
through
right.
your communication,
That's right.
then they're able to come out.
That's right, like Sam, who needed to decide whether he could go on vacation. Just exactly that.
Are people able to actually, though, recover physically and live a normal physical life?
One of the people I saw was having already Cheyne-Stokes breathing, which means she was just about dying and drowning to death. And when I went in to work with her, to make the story short, because I know we're near the end of this particular program, how many minutes we have?
No, just a few.
A few minutes. Well, I went in and I put my hand in on her and followed her breathing like I was talking about, and it turned out that she had gotten afraid. She was dying of cancer, but that sometime earlier in her life she'd become afraid of finishing things. And so I said to her, if you weren't lazy and you weren't afraid, what would you do? And she opened her eyes. Those were the days in Switzerland, too, when they're using whole oxygen tents, not just... She opened her eyes in this oxygen tent. She put her head up, even though she was almost dead. And she said, I have to go back to work and finish up my business on the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. So I said, what does that mean? She said, I have to get my business in order. And she sat up, and she got the edge of the bed, and I said, wait a minute, you can't do that. You got full of tubes. This is not possible. And so I need to also say that some people awaken so much that they forget that they're in the hospital. They want to literally go home, and some need to go home. So you need to be able to work with people in those states, too.
Right.
But I said to her, well, wait a minute, you've got to sign papers, and your family needs to come here and all that. So, but she got up that day, got dressed, and in her very weak state, went home. 6 or 7 years later, she died after having finished up her relationship problems and also worked on her business in downtown Zurich.
Well, I suppose much of the work that you do has to do with the transition then between these states of consciousness.
That's right. It's not enough just to work with subtle signals, and it's not enough just to know the psychology of people. You have to work with the whole transition as that goes from one level to another. That's just right.
Yeah. Arnold Mindell, it's been a pleasure.
What a pleasure, yes.
To talk to you about this work. It's such a joy to be with somebody who has such a range of experience in terms of states of consciousness. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure.
Yes. And thank you very much for being with us.